Okay, let's jump into our topic for discussion today, which is a continuation from last week, and it is on human psychopathy and defense against the psychopath. Now, I'm going to post a couple of videos with this week's podcast, and I do have some images. Last week I had no images because I really wanted to focus and hammer into people the characteristics of the psychopath, the personality traits and characteristics of the psychopathic personality. So I didn't even want any images to get in the way last week so that people can really focus on what this horrid condition that plagues humanity is actually all about. This week I made a few images, and you can find those, as always, on the whatonearthishappening.com radio show page. Click the radio show tab, and you will see listed underneath the player for the show images for today's show. Now that is when the show is live, of course. When the show is not live, I take that off of the radio show page, and it goes into the podcast with the show, okay, with each podcast. So you can find the images also in the podcast section of the website under related images for each podcast that is posted there. Today we have 5 images. The first image was, of course, the Free Your Mind 2 event poster. And the next image begins, we'll do a review from last week, which is the characteristics of psychopaths. And I put some lovely imagery to go along with these couple of slides. Image number 2 shows definite psychopaths that are basically involved in the daily administration of our world. And I'm sure people are just thrilled to see such wonderful pictures here with such in-depth listings of the characteristics of these sick, twisted individuals. So to do a brief review, let's go over some of the characteristics of the psychopath that we talked about last week. And with the podcast, I'm going to post a couple of great documentaries this week. I think very important documentaries to see about the psychopath. There's 2 of them in particular. Is Defense Against the Psychopath, which is a short documentary. I believe it is is right around a half an hour or something like that. And this video really does a good job explaining what psychopathy is and what are the best defense strategies once we recognize that people, certain people that we are interacting with maybe or in fact are psychopaths. We need to wake up to this on a mass scale because psychopaths are actually running all of the institutions that people place their faith in as a society. And, you know, that's not a good idea anyway, to place your faith in institutionalized bodies, because they're all essentially corrupt. And the main thing to keep in mind is that they are ultimately run by psychopaths at the highest levels. Psychopaths have infiltrated the institutions of the world so that they can work their way into positions of influence and power, and thereby hold power and influence over people who basically externalize their power through their belief in these institutional bodies and the belief that they should be directing humanity and taking care of humanity and so forth and so on. We need to start to withdraw our support from these institutions and specifically these so-called leaders. The whole idea here is to get away from the collectivist mindset and understand we don't need leaders, we need to be our own leaders. So, as a brief review, before we start going into other material and into the phone lines, let's take a look at the characteristics of psychopathy. These include aggressiveness. Now, I'm referring to what is listed on slide number 2 right now. Aggressiveness, callousness, the complete absence of conscience, the complete absence of empathy toward other human beings. Cunning thinking. Now, this isn't to say actual intelligence, true holistic intelligence, but cunning intellect would probably be even perhaps better. Left brain intellect only, the desire to control, okay? Adeptness at the manipulation of others, very good at manipulating people. The willingness to engage in strongly immoral criminal conduct to get their way. The willingness to take what they want and do as they please, regardless of who is hurt or wronged. No care for whether someone else suffers. And I know it's very difficult for most people to believe that this is a condition that exists within the human psyche of people who have absolutely no empathy and do not care how much anyone suffers as a result of their actions, but it is the case. And this is, again, split between two different categories of psychopaths. The primary psychopath, who it is a genetic disorder in the human genome, and they are born that way. It doesn't make a difference what environment they are put in. They simply are that way. It is a damaged computer from birth. Again, something many people do not want to face and want to think does not exist. And that doesn't make a difference whether they don't want to believe it or not. This condition is here with us. What created it we'll get into on other shows and possibilities for that. But they don't want to admit that this condition exists due to the implications that it actually means for us here on Earth. The implications are quite disturbing. They're not comfortable whatsoever. They're very disturbing implications because, again, we have to wrestle with that question of what put this condition here with us. Why does it exist? So let's continue to list the characteristics. The willingness to take what they want and do as they please regardless of who is hurt or wronged. A deceptive ability to appear outwardly benevolent. Oh yeah, they'll make you think that they have your own interest in mind, but they absolutely do not. They have only their own selfish motives in mind. So they can behave in superficially charming ways to hide purely selfish motives. They make you think they have your interest in mind when in fact they're not interested in you at all. They have your interest not at all in mind, only their own. They have a willingness to use intimidation and, if necessary, violence to control others in order to satisfy their own needs. So it's their own needs, their own gratification above all else, no matter who has to be harmed in the process. The willingness, we're on slide number 3 now, moving forward to slide number 3. They have the willingness to intentionally violate the basic inherent human rights of other people. A complete absence of any sense of guilt or remorse. So not only don't they feel empathy for what they do, they don't feel guilty after the fact. There is no guilt or remorse shown for the harm that their actions cause to other people. None whatsoever. They rationalize their own immoral behavior. They try to, basically, it's justification. They try to create rights that don't exist and say, oh, well, that was necessary. I had to do that. When in fact, no, they didn't. They wanted to do that. They revel in what they're doing, and then they try to tell other people that it was necessary or needed, or it was for the common good, it was for the long-term good. When in fact, all it was is to satisfy their own twisted, sick, depraved desires that they want to satisfy at the expense of anyone else. They have denial about their own wrongdoing. They'll deny it outright. They'll just lie and say, no, I'm not responsible for that. That's not my responsibility. I didn't cause that. When in fact they were directly to blame or directly at fault, or they were the direct cause of the suffering that was created. Feelings of utter contemptuousness toward the feelings and desires of their fellow human beings. So what your cares or wants or needs or desires are, absolutely meaningless to them. It doesn't make a difference what anyone else may need or what may be important to anyone else. That is completely irrelevant to them. And they have utter contemptuousness. They hate people for the fact that, they have needs, wants, desires, but at the same time, what these psychopaths are doing is doing nothing but trying to fuel their own depraved desires, to satiate their own depraved desires. So, utter contemptuousness displayed toward the feelings and desires of their fellow beings. Willingness to lie pathologically. They'll say anything without any concern for truth in order to advance their own hidden agendas. They have the ability, this is one of the biggest characteristics that people really need to understand and get a handle on. Psychopaths have the ability, especially primary psychopaths. Okay, secondary psychopaths can learn this over time, but primary psychopaths have learned this since they were very young. Okay, so this is more of a characteristic that is mostly attributed to primary psychopaths. They have an ability, a well-developed ability to fake a normal range of human emotions and empathy. See, they watch other people's emotional responses and then they mimic it, even though they're not really feeling those emotions. They mimic it so that they fool other people into believing that they're just like them. And, then the question comes up, well, how do you identify these people? That's a very good question, and some people emailed me about that. These could be anybody. These are basically anybody in society. I mean, they're well hidden, they're well entrenched, and they're entrenched in positions of power. It's very difficult to identify who these people are. You have to know them by their behavior. Number one, first and foremost. The saying, the axiom, that you will know them by their deeds, you will know them by their actions. That's one of the main things to keep in mind. You'll know who these people are by how they behave, first and foremost. We could get into speculation about other possible screening for the psychopath. But again, that would be much more difficult to implement. We have to become streetwise about their behavior in order truly to identify them so that we can be on the defense against them. And again, none of this is to inspire fear or hatred in people. This is about being informed about a condition that does exist. Is basically these people are predatory in nature. They are preying on other people. They are referred to by many people as intra-species predators. They're within our species, and again, I don't really fully agree with that definition because I don't even consider them the same species. I consider this a whole nother animal that looks like a human being, walks and talks like a human being, but ultimately is not really a true human being. There's something else altogether. Because what truly makes a human human, okay, what makes the characteristics of a human being truly human is the ability to feel. And if we lack that, then we're not truly human. We've become something that is degenerated from a human being, that is less than a true human being. And for anybody that wants to say that's divisive or separatist or, is very dualistic, go right ahead. I'm not interested in some new age nonsensical interpretation of what is actual in the world. Okay? Instead of calling it what it is, looking at it honestly, people want to euphemize things. Okay? So they don't have to actually acknowledge the horror of the current human situation. It's all about euphemisms, making things appear less bad than what they actually are. And ladies and gentlemen, what I'm doing, I can't articulate how bad it actually is. Trust me, everything I have done on this show is an understatement regarding how bad our current situation is in the human psyche. It's so infinitely worse than what I could even articulate in words. People have no idea. And, people will call me a pessimist as a result of saying that out in the open. But believe me, it's worse than whatever I'm saying. Okay? I'm actually underplaying where we're at as a species. For some reason, I want people to still accept the notion that we could turn this around if we worked hard enough to influence people in consciousness to come up. And maybe it's possible. But, in a lot of ways, I don't really even know if I believe that myself. And I'm just being honest with people. I'm just being honest. If that makes me a pessimist, so be it. I consider myself a realist regarding where the human dynamic and consciousness is really at, based on what I see on a day-to-day basis in the world. And I try to be as honest as possible about that instead of sugarcoating the situation and telling people what they want to hear. But so many people will sell people on that, telling them what they want to hear. You know, there's so many people who are so good at that. The New Age movement's a big part of that. You know, telling people what they want to hear, making them think it's better than how it actually is, to sell hope. Hope is very sellable. Believe me, it's sellable. All you have to do is look at presidential campaigns and elections. That people think that this, a new guy getting in there is going to mean new hope. And they'll constantly sell people on that because they're just telling people what they want to hear. I'm trying to be honest with people. I'm not in this as a popularity contest. All right? I'm not interested in who likes me or who doesn't like me. That's not why I do what I do. I'm trying to be honest with people about where we're really at. So, we need to understand that it's worse than what I'm saying. And while I don't think that the numbers of primary psychopaths are all that impressive, I think they're very low. I think they're lower than what a lot of clinical psychologists place the number at. I think it's far less than 1%. You know, the people who say, oh, it's the 1%, I think it's maybe the 0.5%. And I think that might be a high number about how many true primary psychopaths there are in humanity. Yet, they're still running the entire show here. They're still in charge because they have infected the rest of the population with their worldview. That's the whole thing. We think largely like the psychopath to a certain extent. Their worldview is still infecting our psyche. And so many people have become secondarily psychopathic, meaning through conditions and through the acceptance of a particular worldview, they are taking on the characteristic traits of a primary psychopath, even though they are not, and they were not born that way. They're behaving that way because of fundamentally flawed axioms and belief systems that they have taken into themselves and are fundamentally attached to. And letting go of those false fundamental axioms, letting go of those dogmatic belief systems, and engaging in new, different information that has the possibility to transform and elevate consciousness. By doing that, it is possible to get one's psyche out of that state, that diseased state, that pathological condition. That's why it's called psychopathy, pathological, based in an illness. Okay? Now, other things are required in the physical domain as well. You know, we need to clean up the body. The body has a lot to do with how we think. We don't often associate that, but the mind and body are intricately and inextricably interconnected. So cleaning up one's diet is a huge part of how we think. So that has to go hand in hand with disconnecting from the poison information, getting onto a positive and truthful information stream, eating better, you know, disconnecting from other poisonous influences around us, meaning the other people with poisonous worldview infections that constantly feed us negative information about the worth of humanity and about, you know, who we truly are as a people. So let's go back to some of the characteristics and wrap this up, because I want to transition this into the defense against the psychopath and then start to go to the phones. Psychopaths, okay, again, the ability to feign normal human emotions, that's very critical. And again, the question then becomes, how do we identify them? Again, we need to know them by their actions, and then we can speculate about possible other techniques to identify these people. They have a severely distorted sense of the consequences of their own actions. See, they don't understand that the universe is going to bring things to balance by one means or another. It's going to bring it to balance, no matter how catastrophic that may need to be, depending on how out of balance things have become. Guaranteed, the universe is going to balance the equation. And these people don't want to understand or accept that aspect of natural law. They refuse. See, they only want their own desires fulfilled and forget about what creation wants. You know, forget about the will of creation. You know, the true evolutionary progress that is happening throughout creation, true evolution in consciousness, that's meaningless to these people. They're trying to stop that from taking place because they want to rule the roost. They want to maintain their positions of dominance and power, illusory power over other people, because they're being given that power by other people who are externalizing their power in an illusory sense and through this nonsensical, illusory belief in authority, which doesn't actually exist in man. So, this severely distorted sense of the consequences of their own behavior. They have total failure to accept any personal responsibility for their own actions. Forget acceptance of responsibility. They always want to deflect. Blame somebody else. It wasn't my fault. I refuse to take responsibility for what they clearly have done. And you know, this is part of the human condition on a wider sense. We don't want to take responsibility as a people for what we have allowed the psychopaths to do and for what we continue to do because they're ordering us to do it. See, this refusal of responsibility, to accept personal responsibility, this goes, our refusal as largely as a people is a reflection of the psychopaths' refusal to accept personal responsibility. Because they don't want to accept responsibility, okay? They try to pass the buck down to the next person. In other words, if they could get away with it, they would prefer not to actually do the behavior, but to tell someone else to do the behavior. That's how they think they're going to shield themselves or insulate themselves from the repercussions of natural law. They're going to get somebody else to do their dirty work for them. And then most of us will do that. We'll just do it for a paycheck or do it to make our lives easier in some form or fashion. Okay? Because most of us don't have a developed sense of conscience. We won't say no. And this is the whole problem. We continue to uphold the psychopaths. They're a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction, and yet they're ruling billions of people because we can't continue to do their bidding. And they have the hordes of secondary psychopaths in the police, the military, the government, educational institutions, medical institutions, pharmaceuticals, etc. You name any institution in the world, banking, okay? The secondary psychopaths largely are running these institutions. Just put your head down, do what you're told, do your job, and you'll get your reward for doing it. It doesn't matter who you have to hurt, okay? We'll try to shield you from seeing the suffering that you're causing, okay? They're really good at continuing to do that, you know? And most people will just go ahead and do that. And in doing that, they're numbing out their emotions and they're ultimately turning. So very slowly, it's a stepwise progress, a progression over time, turning into a secondary psychopath who are acting as the hordes that do the bidding of the primary psychopath masters that are ruling at the highest levels of the institutions. And this is what we need to understand, that the only way to stop the progression of this tyranny in our world is to stop behaving like the psychopath. Meaning, if you know that something is wrong, and you know it's ultimately violating the rights of someone else, you have to pull your actions back from that through the process of apophasis, saying no, the lost word, the most powerful word in the universe. Say no to that which you know is not a right, to that which you know is causing harm to someone else. And if more people did that, The psychopaths could never possibly have their way. They could never create the world that they want to create because no one would help them do it. Unfortunately, too many people are willing to help these psychopaths create the world in the image that they want to create it in. Because since they've worked their way up to the positions of power already and infiltrated those positions, these institutions shouldn't even exist to have these positions of power. That's the entire problem. We believe that there is such a thing as power invested in institutions that is going to tell people how they should behave and act. That's the entire problem. That's a collectivist worldview. And the whole problem is psychopaths invariably, unwaveringly, will worm their way into those institutionalized positions of power, take them over, and then once they're entrenched, it's very difficult to get them out. They run those institutions generationally, passing down their influence to the next breed of psychopaths. And this is another reason that a lot of psychopaths, especially in royalty, are huge into inbreeding, because they want to keep the characteristic traits of primary psychopathy, which is contained in the genetic information to a large extent in the family, so that their bloodlines can continue to stay in those same institutionalized positions of influence and power. It may only make sense. I mean, if you just sit and think about it, it makes perfect sense. So, to finish up the characteristics of the psychopath, the final characteristic is that they believe that they'll never be brought to justice. They think they can do what they're doing indefinitely and never be held to account. And I said last week, in a very strong, forceful, and no uncertain term way, they are incorrect about that. I know that they're incorrect about that, because in one way or another, whether it happens in the physical domain or not, they are going to be held to account. And so is everyone who is helping them. Just let me repeat that one more time. Regardless of where or when it is going to take place, the psychopaths of this world are going to be held to account for their behavior. So is everyone who is helping them. And you could not believe that if you want, but your disbelief will never make that statement untrue. That is how the universe functions, to bring balance to creation. Now, as to how or when, I can't necessarily say, but guaranteed it will happen. The universe will that into existence at some point in time. Now, I think the way that they should be brought to balance is through our actions to counter and defend ourselves against the psychopath. I don't think we should leave it to the spiritual justice of the universe, quite frankly. I think that's a cop-out for our experience in the physical domain. So I believe we have the right to bring these people to justice ourselves. I ultimately believe that's how the universe would prefer to bring these psychopaths to justice, through people who are acting within right behavior. See, if that doesn't happen, that means ultimately there wasn't a quantum number of people who are willing to get involved and make that justice occur. So the universe is going to do it for us in a very unpleasant way, and in a way that is going to not only bring them to justice, but it's going to ultimately bring all the other people to justice for not acting on behalf of the universe and holding them to account in the first place. And this is where humanity is almost at that point. And people will say, oh, that's alarmist, you're inspiring fear and saying something bad's going to happen if people don't act. Well, it's the truth. You think that we can just let these psychopaths do immoral behaviors forever and there's nothing that's going to result to us, nothing bad is going to happen, and that this is part of what tyranny is ultimately all about. Because the causal factor, that we are not bringing them to justice, that we are not standing up for our inherent human rights, the world is slipping further and further into global totalitarian tyranny. That's one of the ways that we're being punished by the entire, construct of natural law, because we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing in getting these people out of these positions of power, stop externalizing our power to these so-called leadership institutions, and start actually being our own leaders and live for what we know is right. Not enough people are willing to do that. Not enough people are actually engaging in that behavior. So at some point, the universe is going to step in and say, enough is enough. There's been a stagnation here. No progress is possible. And therefore, cleansing is going to be required. Like when weeds choke a garden, ultimately they're going to have to be uprooted. And if we become like those weeds choking the garden, which is evolutionary progression in consciousness, which is what the purpose of the garden is for, if we become those allegorical weeds, then we're going to have to be uprooted at some point when no further growth is possible. And the universe will be all too happy to provide that service for us. Do we want that to occur that way? I think it's a very bad choice, personally. But ultimately, that's what's going to happen. So the next part I want to get into this is understanding that we already inherently have the right to defend ourselves against psychopaths, about people that don't care about right or wrong, that don't care about conscience, that aren't acting within conscience, that are just doing what they want to do to get what they want. And this is the whole, let me just be very clear about this. This is the whole dynamic, the whole personality characteristic, or the rationalization of, I'm just doing my job. Okay? That whole thing that people trot out as a justification, ultimately it means, here's what you're saying. I want people to be very laser focused on what I'm saying here. When someone is saying, I'm just doing my job, and the action that they're taking is actually hurting someone else or usurping their rights through some form of coercion that they had no right to initiate. All right? When that's happening and someone is saying, I'm just doing my job, what they're basically saying is, my collection of money or resources or acquiring a position that I might want usurps someone else's free will to engage in their rights or to not be harmed, not have initiatory force carried out against them when there was no right to do so. Okay? They're basically saying, I don't care about that person being harmed. That is the definition of not having conscience, of not exercising conscience. You could even make the argument whether the person has the knowledge of right or wrong, which is what conscience is, knowledge, science, to know together. Science, the root of it being sciere, the verb in Latin sciere, which means to know, and the prefix con being put in front of it, which means together or with. So to know together, to know with everyone else. Common sense of right and wrong. That's what conscience is. Common knowledge, common sense knowledge. Whether they actually possess that or not, they're not exercising it. They're not acting, willfully acting within harmony with conscience, with that knowledge. So therefore, they are abandoning conscience by saying, I'm going to do what my job says I need to do to collect my paycheck or to maintain that position, regardless of who it's harming. By definition, that is a psychopathic characteristic. You are taking on at least one of the characteristics of psychopathy. Well, it's rationalization of your own immoral behavior. Okay? It's attempt to lay blame upon someone else for your own conduct. You're saying the people who gave me these orders are ultimately responsible. You're denying your own wrongdoing outright. Okay? You're willing to violate the inherent human rights of other people. You're willing to engage in criminal conduct to get your way. And it's all to just, again, have your needs satisfied or met at the expense of someone else's rights. And I would suggest a large portion, or if not the majority, of people who are in institutions where they're saying, I'm just doing my job, and are ultimately violating the rights of other people, have become secondarily psychopathic at the very least. And what our job is, people who understand the non-aggression principle, who know that if someone else is not violating someone else's rights, you do not have any right to initiate force against them. That's what the non-aggression principle is. It's all about statements in the negative. If someone else is not usurping someone else's rights or using violence, okay, then you do not have a right to initiate force against them. It's all apophatic. It's stated in the negative. You have to understand what you don't have a right to do. People think that rights that do not exist actually exist for certain groups of people. They think that rights that no one on earth has, a bunch of people can come together, create that right, and then grant it to another person or group of people. And that cannot be done. There's no such thing as the delegation of a wrong. This needs to be deeply understood by people. You cannot delegate something that you have no right to do to someone else or to any number of people. Doesn't matter how many people erroneously believe you can do that, it still cannot be done in nature. You could do it in an erroneous construct that exists only within the diseased human psyche, but you cannot do it in actual point-of-fact reality, meaning in nature. It cannot be accomplished. Nature is not going to recognize creation, is not going to recognize that as being real. It's your illusion that you've given substance to by believing that you can do it, and then acting within that illusory capacity. But it's not real in nature. It's an illusion in a diseased mind that you can delegate a wrong. Wrongs cannot be delegated to anyone because no one has the right to do them. By definition, they are in opposition to right, they are in opposition to morality and natural law, then they cannot be engaged in by any justification or rationalization. See, the only way people believe that they can engage in a wrong or delegate a wrong to someone else is if they accept the fundamentally flawed axiom called moral relativism. Moral relativism must be accepted somewhere in the person's psyche in order for them to believe that a wrong can be delegated. Because if you understand the absolute objective nature of right and wrong, you understand it is impossible if someone does not have a right, meaning if the behavior is a wrong because it causes harm to others, then, and no one on earth has it as an individual, that action can never be delegated to a group of people. Any other individual or group, it's an impossibility to do in point of fact reality. Yet, humanity does it every day in every corner of the world. Giving rights to police and military that they'll say that the public doesn't have. We need to understand we already possess the right to defend ourselves. We don't need any institutions to exercise inherent rights to self-defense against people that would cause us harm, who don't care. And the institutions who are ostensibly doing that defense, which they're not really doing, they're serving the desires of the psychopath. If you are honest with yourself, that's what they're doing. They're the army for the psychopaths. The people who we say, who we claim are actually, the defenders of the people. They're nothing of the kind. They're the army for the psychopath to defend the psychopaths against the people, against the bulk of humanity. They don't have the rights to do what they're doing. And rationalization and justification to say, I'm only doing my job by usurping your rights, doesn't hold any water. And it shouldn't be accepted by anyone. So, moving to image number 4, we need to re-examine something that we talked about in the section that we talked about on natural law, and that is the dichotomy, the total polarization. These are diametric opposites. People use these terms synonymously, and they are not synonyms. They are antonyms. They are exact diametric opposites. They are the antitheses of each other. Force and violence have nothing to do with each other. People really need to deeply understand this from a natural law perspective. Violence has nothing to do with the proper use of force. You can look at it in terms of use versus abuse. Use versus abuse. You have a right to use force. You have no right ever to engage in violence. And what is the determining factor or characteristic between these two types of action? The determining characteristic is the initiation. Who started it? A big part of brainwashing, particularly in American culture, but I would probably suggest that this brainwashing goes on all over the world, is that it matters who starts violence. That it doesn't matter who starts violence. The brainwashing is that it doesn't matter who starts violence. What I'm telling people is, all that matters is who starts it. That's what defines it as violence. When someone is breaking the non-aggression principle, it means that they have initiated or started to use force that they had no right to initiate or use. And they're using it in a coercive capacity. They're not using it in a capacity which force is morally intended to be used in. If there was no moral use of force, we wouldn't have the capacity to engage in the universe. Of course there are moral uses of force. There is no such thing as a moral use of violence. And see, I want to give a couple of examples here. I want to look at this dynamic. What is force versus what is violence? How are they diametrically opposed? What are their characteristics? I want to give a couple of examples and very clearly delineate which behaviors in the examples would be violent and which behaviors would simply be forceful. Which behavior, if it is violent, means it is a wrong and the person had no right to engage in that behavior, versus what actions were simply the proper use of force and the person had every right to engage in that behavior. Okay? And then I want to read the Second Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. And again, I'm not a constitutionalist. I've made no bones about it that I don't believe in authority. I don't believe in government. These are illusory constructs that exist in a diseased psyche. I am an anarchist. I understand that there are no masters. There are no rulers. There is only claims of authority and then the acceptance of those claims by dumb people. We'll get into this on the other side of this station break. Stay with us, ladies and gentlemen. You're listening to What on Earth is Happening. We'll be right back.